You are not failing because you lack discipline. You are failing because you are using violence against your own mind. That sentence alone explains years of frustration. Most people believe change requires force, tight control, ruthless discipline, a kind of inner war. But look carefully at your own history. Every time you try to dominate an impulse, it doesn't disappear. It retreats, waits, and comes back stronger. That's not weakness. That's biology. Here is the mistake almost no one talks about. Every habit you want to destroy once saved you. It reduced stress. It soft loneliness. It gave you relief when you didn't know another way. When you attack that habit, your brain doesn't hear growth. It hears danger. And when the brain senses danger, it does what it was designed to do. It protects what feels familiar. This is why promises break. This is why relapses hurt more than the habit itself. This is why shame becomes fuel for the same cycle you want to escape. In Japan, this war never existed. They don't try to conquer the mind. They study it. They don't crush impulses. They observe them. They don't fight the river. They redirect the current. And here is the uncomfortable truth. As long as you are trying to eliminate a habit, you will stay tied to it. What you resist, you reinforce. What you hate in yourself, you keep alive. This video is not motivation. It is not comfort. It is Ami. If you feel like you've tried everything and still return to the same patterns, this is not content to consume. It is a tool, and tools only work for people willing to stop running from what needs to be seen. If this kind of clarity matters to you, staying connected to this channel is not about algorithms. It is a quiet commitment to your own development, a signal that you are done pretending the problem is lack of willpower. Because from here forward, you're going to see why force never worked, and why real change begins the moment you stop attacking yourself. You are not fighting habits. You are fighting a nervous system designed to avoid pain and conserve energy. Once you understand this, guilt becomes irrelevant and strategy becomes possible. The human brain was not built for fulfillment. It was built for survival. It prioritizes what is predictable, familiar, and immediately relieving. It does not care if that relief costs you clarity, health, or self-respect years later. The brain does not calculate years. It responds to now. Every habit operates as a neural shortcut, a well-paved internal road that promises fast relief. When you smoke, overeat, drink, scroll, or procrastinate, dopamine is released not because the behavior is good, but because it is known. Dopamine does not reward pleasure. It rewards repetition. This is where most people get trapped. When you try to stop a habit using force, the brain interprets it as a threat. Something that once provided safety is being removed. The system responds by increasing urgency. The urge becomes louder. The craving becomes obsessive. Not because you are weak, but because the brain is protecting stability. This is not self-sabotage. It is misplaced self-protection. Western psychology tried to solve this with control. Eastern philosophy noticed something else. Whatever you try to expel from the mind clings harder. Not because it is powerful, but because you are giving it reactive attention, attention charged with fear, anger, and judgment. In Japanese contemplative traditions, impulses are not treated as commands. They are treated as events, temporary signals moving through awareness. When you stop arguing with them, they lose their authority. Modern neuroscience confirms this. When an impulse is observed without action, the prefrontal cortex regains influence. The amygdala quiets down. The nervous system begins to regulate itself. But when you enter internal combat, the primitive brain takes control. This is why absolute promises fail. Never again sounds like security to the ego, but threat to the nervous system. The brain does not understand absolutes. It understands loss. The real problem was never a lack of discipline. It was excess confrontation. As long as you believe change requires self-violence, you will stay trapped, because no lasting transformation grows from rejection. It only grows from understanding. And now comes the part most people avoid facing. What staying exactly like this will cost you over time. Nothing collapses all at once, but everything charges interest over time. The habit you think is manageable does not stay contained. It expands quietly. It reshapes your days, your energy, and eventually your identity. What begins as a small relief becomes a default response. And what becomes default slowly defines who you are allowed to be. The real damage is not the behavior itself. It is the message repeated to your nervous system. You are not in charge here. Every time you act on impulse without awareness, the brain learns something dangerous. It learns that urges are orders. And once urges become orders, internal freedom disappears. Over time, something subtler happens. You lose sensitivity. Pleasure dulls, discomfort blurs. Life becomes functional but flat. You get through days. You stay busy. You perform. But presence thins out. You are technically alive, but rarely fully here. This is where most people land without noticing. Not broken enough to panic. Not aligned enough to feel peace. Suspended, delaying change with promises of later. After this project, after this phase, after things calm down. But here's the truth few confront. The brain does not reorganize itself through intention. It reorganizes through repetition. If you keep feeding the same pathways, you will keep receiving the same results. Not because you lack insight, but because insight without practice changes nothing. There is also a deeper cost. Each unobserved habit erodes something invisible. Authorship. You begin reacting more than choosing. And when choosing becomes tiring, anything that numbs or distracts becomes tempting. That is the real risk. Not addiction, not failure, automation. Living on autopilot while telling yourself you are in control. If nothing changes, There will be no dramatic breakdown. There will only be more of the same. And for someone with awareness and potential, that is the most silent form of loss. What comes next is the moment where this pattern tightens the exact point where comfort overrides clarity again and again. There is a specific moment when you lose. It happens fast, quietly, almost invisibly. It is the instant discomfort appears and the mind offers relief, a shortcut, a justification. Just this once, I deserve it. That moment does not feel like a decision. It feels like gravity. At that point, the habit is no longer the issue. The nervous system is trying to return to balance as quickly as possible. Comfort is not pleasure. Comfort is the temporary absence of tension, and the brain will choose that absence over clarity every time, unless something interrupts the pattern. This is where the inner conflict sharpens. One part of you knows better. It understands consequences, values, long-term direction, but it speaks calmly, logically, without urgency. The other part speaks in sensation, tightness in the chest, restlessness in the body, images of relief. And sensation always feels more real than thought. That is why discipline fails when it arrives late. By the time you try to be strong, chemistry is already in motion. The body has already leaned forward. Control at this stage feels like resistance, and resistance feels like pain. Most people respond by trying harder, more rules, more restriction, more rigidity. But rigidity creates fracture. The nervous system begins to associate change with suffering, and whatever the brain associates with suffering becomes a threat. Here is the paradox no one explains. The harder you try to control the impulse at its peak, the less control you actually have. It is like trying to stop a wave after it has already broken. Effort only pulls you under. This is also where identity begins to erode. You stop saying, I am experiencing an impulse. You start saying, this is who I am. And identity is the deepest trap. Because once behavior becomes identity, change feels like self-erasure. The habit no longer just soothes discomfort. It confirms a story about your limits, and every repetition makes that story feel true. But there is a flaw in this loop. The impulse does not begin at the moment you give in. It begins earlier, much earlier, in the subtle tightening, in the narrowing of attention, in the first physiological shift you usually ignore. And it is there before the battle where real change happens. What comes next is not a technique of force. It is a method of awareness, one that ends the war without escaping responsibility, one that reorganizes the mind instead of breaking it. The exit was never in confrontation. It was always in presence. The Japanese approach does not begin at the peak of the impulse. It begins earlier, at the first signal. The slight change in breath, the subtle restlessness in the body, the narrowing of attention. That is the real point of choice, and almost no one is conscious there. The practice is simple, but uncompromising. Observe without interfering. When the urge appears, you do not negotiate. You do not suppress. You do not distract yourself. You stay. You feel. You name it. Urge. Nothing more. No story. No judgment. That naming alone creates space. And where there is space, there is freedom. From a neurological perspective, that pause shifts control back to the prefrontal cortex. From a philosophical perspective, it breaks identification. You stop being the impulse and return to being the awareness watching it. This is not passive. It is precisi. Then comes the second pillar. Small, consistent redirection. Do not try to become a different person tomorrow. Change one detail today. 5 minutes. One gesture. One ritual. Small enough to avoid resistance. Meaningful enough to repeat. Repetition, not intensity, is what rewires the brain. And this is the part most people resist. You do not remove a habit. You outgrow it by building something that serves the same need with more alignment. When a new path becomes familiar, the old one fades without violence. This is not control. It is orientation. When you stop hating yourself for having impulses, they lose strength. When you stop defining yourself by what you are trying to escape, a new identity begins to form, one rooted in choice, not reaction. That is the essence of not perfection, not domination, but presence. If something here resonated, not as an idea, but as recognition, that is already change in motion. And if you stayed until this moment, leave the word presence in the comments. That is the signal. It shows you didn't just listen. You stayed. And staying is where everything begins.